Tyler. Uh, Adam, can you enable share screen? Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So today is week 3, as Adam said. The topic for tonight is old Earth or new Earth in terms of how old and age-wise the Earth is. And I know for when we did the survey in the intro class in the first week, we had about 40% of people say old Earth, 40% of people said new Earth, and about 20% said, like, why does it matter? And hopefully we'll kind of address that and get to it as to why it matters. So once again, just to reiterate the series purpose, first and foremost, this is not to convince you or force you to agree with any of these ideas that we're presenting, but hopefully it can help us to, number 2, to inform us about current scientific understanding of these key topics. And hopefully that understanding and information will help to challenge us to rethink or reaffirm our beliefs and viewpoints of God. And ultimately, this is to lead us to number 4, which is to realize that what may be non-issues for us coming to Christ may prevent others from coming to Christ. So just wanted to reiterate that as always. I just insert this slide just a couple minutes ago because I know some people might be missing lessons and missing classes. So in the first lesson, we kind of were just talking about why should we care about science as Christians, and kind of the points I wanted to drive home in that class was basically that just what I've been saying in this series purpose, that sometimes when we say we don't believe in evolution, we don't believe in the Big Bang, even though that doesn't stop us from coming to Christ, it might stop certain people from professions who work in those areas. And so if we take some of these hard stances, sometimes that prevents people from coming to Christ. And if we can learn more about it, then maybe we can expand God to fit in those questions and remove that conflict. And so there's not this divide between science and faith, but they can both live in harmony. And then lesson 2, we started getting into some of these scientific topics. And the question was, how did the universe start? We went through Genesis 1, saying how the Bible says the universe started with God speaking the word of life into existence, versus contrasting that with the Big Bang. And we kind of gave somewhat of a conclusion of how we can resolve that conflict is that we can say that God initiated the Big Bang and creation started from there, as the point we kind of led into at the end of that. But for tonight, just to outline what we want to talk about tonight, I have a series of questions we want to kind of address. And number 1 is just, what is young Earth creationism? There's a little bit of separation there. Pretty self-explanatory, but we'll get into it. Second question is, what is old Earth creationism? And all the kind of claims and things we can talk about with that. Finally, we'll get into the science of it all and how does science say the world was made, specifically the Earth. And then getting to the last point of how can this conflict be resolved. So to begin with, young Earth creationism, I have a quote from the 15th century. So in 1644, Sir John Lightfoot, he was the vice chancellor of Cambridge, so a pretty prestigious academic university. And he said this quote here that I'll read for you all. And he said that heaven and earth, center and circumference, were created all together in the same instant in clouds full of water, and that this work took place and man was created by the Trinity on October 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning. And he said this with such great understanding and knowing exactly when God created the world and exactly when God initiated creation. Which in my mind is a little foolish that you can get down right to the date and time. That was 9 o'clock in the morning. But, how did they reach this conclusion? And basically, the Bible lays out extensive genealogies that I know some of us may skip in times when we're reading through the Bible. And there's also, you can back this up with archaeological evidence of when the Bible says things happen, and we can back it up and say, oh, yes, it did occur on the same date. And also, you have to keep in mind in 1644 that the idea that even the Earth was not the center of the solar system and that the sun was not really even an idea yet, and it was just getting started. The whole Renaissance and the whole science movement had not really started yet. So science had no input. All we had was faith. All we had was the Bible to back up when creation and when everything had started. And so it was the consensus in that time period that the world was exactly 6,000 years old, and everything was perfect because of that. However, I was going to give just a little bit of example of some genealogies, and we can kind of break through this down a little bit. So if someone would love to read this for us, this is the first 6 verses of Matthew. So anyone would like to read this for us tonight?
I will. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father Aminadab.
I think that's how I would pronounce it.
Hey, it started off easy here. All right.
Yeah, it gets pretty tough.
Aminadab, the father of Nahshon, Nahshon, the father of Salmon, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, father of King David.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. I know it's tough. It's a whole bunch of names. Well, I think most of us as Christian, we like to skip these parts. But genealogy, especially to the Jews at this time, was really critically important. It kind of show where you came from. And especially for Matthew, he starts this as the beginning of his gospel. And I think he does it for a point. And if you continue on the genealogies, he does the next couple generations from King David to the exile to Babylon, and then the generations going from the exile back to Israel and culminating with Jesus. And he listed out where it's exactly 14 generations from Abraham to King David, exactly 14 generations from King David to the exile, and then exactly 14 generations from the exile to Jesus. With 14 being a multiple of 7, it's the idea of perfection and an idea that Jesus is the embodiment of Abraham, the seed that comes from Abraham. So there's definitely a purpose as to why Matthew lays it out this way. And the reason why I dig into this is that it's really not possible, the genealogy as it's portrayed this way. And so as I was studying for this, I was reading into it, and biblically it's all accurate. All these names are what is listed in Bible, whether it's in Exodus or sorry, not Exodus, Genesis, when he's listing the descendants of Jacob that's going to the land of Egypt, then picks up again in First Chronicles, and then you get to see this again in Matthew. But Judah and Hezron are both taken into Egypt. And then we know from Exodus writings that the Israelites are in Egypt for 400 years. And Nahshon and Abinadab both come out of Egypt, and Nahshon actually becomes the leader of Judah in the wilderness. So both Abinadab and Nahshon are alive when Moses is alive 400 years later, and we only have Ram separating them. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And not saying that this is not true, because we can still say they are the father because they're still the lineage. There's definitely a gap, and there's more generations there that are unaccounted for. The same thing is true when we kind of go from Nahshon and Salmon jumping down to Boaz. Judges takes place before King David takes the throne, and Judges was also a period of about 300 years. And so we don't really have enough people to get us that 300 years. The same thing is true for the rest of the genealogy of Jesus, that there are definitely breaks, not so much in the kings in that 14 generations, but definitely in the exile. There's some gaps in generations. And so I don't want to point this out saying the Bible is wrong. It's still true because they are kind of fathers, still the lineage is correct. But it's definitely longer, which kind of disputes the claim of young earth creationists that the world is 6,000 years old based off the genealogies, because there are gaps and a little bit of misnomers. So that's the reason why I kind of point that out. And it brings me to a point I'll raise a couple of times, that the Bible is true, but doesn't always mean it is always historically accurate, I guess is the best way to phrase it. We know it's true because it's the father, really my great grandfather, great 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 grandfather, but it might not be as literal as we think it is. So, how does a young Earth creationist viewpoint conflict with science? There's lots of things that I can say. The biggest thing is that, as we read Genesis 1 last week, we can talk about how the Bible says it's formless and without form, and he goes into that in Genesis 1. But there's certain processes we know, and we know the time rate in which they occur. And one is actually the formation of like stalactites or stalagmites. And I think Brett Todd actually might have been with this like cave trip to me. But how you can always remember stalactites or stalagmites is a little fun fact. So stalactites hang tight to the ceiling, and stalagmites might reach the ceiling one day. So you can remember which way to grow.
Brett, is that true? Were you on the trip?
Pretty sure it was like a boy or a Cub Scout trip.
Yeah, I know what trip you're talking about,
Yeah.
but no, I don't think I ever went on one of those.
You missed out. But we know that growth rate, and it's like 0.002 inches per year. And for some of the record stalactites and stalagmites and columns that we have in caves, that like doesn't compute that rate for saying the world's only 6,000 years old. And there's other evidence. This is just one because there's a little pretty picture with it. But here's some of the claims the young Earth creationists say about science. And this is claims I've heard. I don't want to say the Church of Christ has always been hateful of science, but at least in my personal experience, I remember being in 4th grade and we had a retreat and we had a special guest speaker come. And she told us these couple of claims, and she did it, in like kid style. So she said, okay, claim number 1, intense water pressure affects carbon dating. And so she went to this group of 4th and 5th graders and was like, do you guys know from a story from the Bible where there was intense water pressure? And, we all raised our hands like, oh, the flood, the flood, the flood. And so in their viewpoint and their claim was the flood caused intense water pressure, which then affected carbon dating. So therefore, yeah, science says it's 4.5 billion years old, but that was all messed up by the flood. So therefore, we're right at 6,000 years old. Another claim that they told us on this retreat when I was a 4th grader was intense heat affects carbon dating. And so then they again asked us, boys and girls, like, can you think of a story from the Bible where there's intense heat? And you're like, oh yeah, like Sodom and Gomorrah. God rains down fire. He also rains down fire in Egypt. That messed up some of the carbon dating there. That's why scientists are wrong. And, that really affected me as a 4th grader because I thought that, and I am very intellectual. So I like put it in my brain. And when people tell me that, I would say these claims back to them and they wouldn't know the science that great either. Like, oh, I guess maybe you are right. And it wasn't until I was actually in college that I realized this is actually really wrong in terms of chemistry. So both claims of this is not true at all, at least in terms of our current scientific understanding. Water pressure and heat does not affect the decay rates of these carbon isotopes. That's how they do it. Basically, some carbon, like for that element, is a specific weight, and other ones are actually slightly heavier, and then they decay to that lower rate. And we have all that ground up, and we know those rates, and it doesn't affect that way. You can also check other elements. Other elements have radioactive isotopes, and you can check, and it's not true. So both these claims young Earth creationists say, at least in light of scientific understanding, are not true. And that's something that I at least have been told before by young Earth creationists. There's other evidence you can say for, at least from science perspective on young Earth creationism. The growth rate of trees doesn't quite match. We even have some living trees that are almost like 5,000 to 6,000 years old currently. And then we also have trees that have fallen over that go back 10 to 12,000 years already. And so that goes past that 6,000 time limit for young Earth creationism. You also have to deal with the idea of fossil records, and specifically dinosaurs with young Earth creationism. And I had never heard this in the Church of Christ, but I had friends tell me this claim. And some people at a church I visited in Nashville told me this once, is that God didn't put fossils and dinosaurs in the ground, Satan did, and it's a distraction for us as Christians. So if you believe strong enough, you won't be distracted by the fossil records and the dinosaurs. I don't know how that affects a little kid growing up, but at least I didn't have to hear that. So it's definitely claims young Earth creationists have made, and I've heard them make from directly or indirectly. So it's definitely some of the things that disputes the young Earth creationists' claim that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. I think we can go into a cool question now. So I'll ask this question and we'll have Adam pause it so we can go into it, and we'll open up for group discussion. But the question is, do you think that young Earth creationism is a viable option for us to believe today? All really good points. Some of the comments by Nicole and Tyler, I think, and maybe someone else, actually kind of leads into old Earth creation. So a little nice segue. So what is old Earth creationism? There's really two sects, and we'll kind of get into it. So in the mid 1800s to mid 1900s, science kind of began to prove the age of the Earth to be 4.54 billion years old. And obviously that conflicts a lot with just 6,000 years. And so to rectify this conflict, creationists stated that, just as Tyler pointed out, that God made an Earth that already had the appearance of being old, that already had caves, already had rivers and valleys and mountains, and already had trees that were old and all the like, and could even have made fossils already there. And there's two main groups of old Earth creationism. One is that God still created the Earth 6,000 years ago, and then just with the appearance of being old. So it's kind of just a little bit of an extension of young Earth creation, that still it's been 6,000 years ago from the literal 6 days where God created the Earth, and it just gave the appearance of old. There's another frame that doesn't say it's a literal 6 days, a literal 24 hours, 6 times, but that is kind of like what is time to God when he says that. So that God created the Earth over a large time frame, and therefore it's old, but he did it like very succinctly, like it was instantaneously, but over a course of billions of years. So that's the two main groups of old Earth creationism. The implications of the old Earth creation view, especially for that first sect that we talked about, is light actually is the biggest issue with it. So light has a constant speed, and actually if the speed of light changes at all, basically all, at least of our known ways we think about the universe as scientists, breaks down. And so if God did create the Earth as an appearance of being old, but it was merely just 6,000 years ago, we have this galaxy, which is our closest galaxy to the Milky Way. It's the Andromeda galaxy. I think it's 14 million light years away. Don't hold me to that distance. But that distance is basically how long light would have to travel at 1 year, and then how many millions of years it would be. So if Earth was really made 6,000 years ago with the appearance of being old, and there's all these galaxies and universes also, God would have had to put light 6,000 millions of light years closer to Earth so that we could see it with our eyes and with with telescopes. So it's hard for me to grasp my mind around that, because that feel a little bit like deception to me, a little bit of God just putting light in different places. So we go, oh, that universe, what we think was made 14 million years ago, but really was made 6,000 years ago, and God moved the light so that it appears like it's 14 million years old. So it gets a little weird in terms of physics and the things we know now. But there's other things you can do about it. So old Earth creationism is still very much seen as a middle ground between young Earth creationism and then going all the way to theistic evolution. So there's different claims that I already mentioned a little bit of. So one is the 6 days of creation in Genesis were not literal 24 hours. They took place over a larger scale of time. And if you make that claim, it's pretty nicely, because then you don't have to worry about the light thing like I did for a literal 6 days. So this agrees with physics, can agree with chemistry, agrees with geology. It fits everything very nicely in terms of making that claim and justifying it by science. The only issues for claiming old Earth creationism, and it also leads into our lesson for next week, is they make the claim that fossil record does not show evolution, and thus God created things slowly so that we have the fossil record, but it was all at once in terms of creation. So, we can say, for instance, fish were made a lot sooner than land animals were. So God made all the fish animals all at once in their different species, different groups, but it's all instantaneously. There was no what's called macroevolution. And the third point going into that is they mostly do agree with microevolution. We'll get into this more next week, which is also why we had to do this first topic this week. So microevolution is just kind of the small changes we see within a species. So like for humans, you can do skin color, like, or height or eye color or build, muscle mass, all of those small variations we see in humans. But as far as going from a monkey-like species to a human-like species, they don't believe in the separation of those species. So that's what macroevolution is. So these are mostly the claims of old Earth creationism for them to fit. Most of it fits really nicely in terms of physics, chemistry, and geology. It's more or less so biology that they don't fit with. And scientifically, 100% basic scientists agree that evolution did occur, which we'll talk about next week, which is why we had to talk about age of the Earth this week. So we'll get to this next question that we have. So outside young Earth creation, we talked about this a little bit, so if no one has anything else to add, we can kind of skip it. I'll still leave the option open. Do you think that old Earth creationism is a viable option for us to believe today? Now we're getting to that third question: how does science say the planets form? Basically, the answer is gravity, one of those 4 basic elemental forces that's in the universe. So basically, like, after the Big Bang occurred, or God said bang, there was a ton of hydrogen gas in the universe. And as gravity pulled bigger chunks together, basically they all kind of amalgamated together. And as they got under intense pressure, that ignites and you start burning and fusing hydrogen into helium. And that starts what we know as of stars. And the stars at the very beginning of the universe were extremely massive. And actually, the more massive a star is, the faster and brighter it burns. And it burns through all that hydrogen really fast. And actually, it starts fusing more elements together. And that's actually how we'll get other elements. I have another slide to talk about that. But it hits a point where it can't fuse anymore. And then that's the point where basically the fusion interaction that's pushing the sun out and gravity that's pulling it back in, they no longer cancel out, and the fusion energy busts out of the seams, and that's what causes the star to explode. And as they explode, they expel out all of their guts, and those guts can gather and form either new stars, and also other times those stars can form. There's other guts on the outside, gravity pulls them together, and that's how planets form slowly over time. And just to show that a little bit more figures, as where all these different atoms came from. So obviously at first you have hydrogen up at the top. So the sun burns hydrogen first, it burns it into helium. When a lot of the hydrogen runs out, it starts fusing helium into bigger and stronger elements. And you get all the way down to iron in your periodic table. And iron cannot fuse in a normal star. And so that iron core builds up and builds up and builds up. And that's actually what causes the star to explode. But we have other elements besides iron that are higher up on the periodic table. So like, how do we get those that are in our Earth today? And so a star actually has to die not once, but a star has to die twice to get those other elements. So basically, in really massive stars, much bigger than our sun, when they get to iron and they finally explode, sometimes gravity contracts everything back in really small. And that's what causes what's called a neutron star. And neutron stars, there's about like 36 to 40, I think, in our galaxy, but there are lots of known universe. But they're very interesting and weird phenomenons that occur in physics. And like 1 teaspoon of a neutron star weighs more than all of New York City together. So they're extremely dense stars and they burn really bright. But then what happens sometimes is neutron stars actually collide with other neutron stars. They have a fancy name called a magnetar. They get really weird names from these physicists. But when neutron stars combine and collide, when their guts explode out, that's how we get all the other elements in our periodic table that we have on Earth. And so this happened a lot in the beginning stages of the universe in the first kind of 4 to 5 billion years. And then we started getting more stable stars that were smaller, like our sun, and then more planets formed. And that's how our planet formed 4.5 billion years ago, was through gravity and these kind of guts of not 1, but 2 stars, where we're able to have all these other elements such as iron, but also gold and platinum and some of these other precious metals. So just to reiterate, I know it's kind of tough to go through all the way, but over millions of years, gravity collected material together. And the collisions kept getting bigger and bigger as they go on and growing more and more. That's initially how our sun was ignited, and then eventually how our 8 planets were formed. And then for our moon, what happened was basically Earth was collided with this planet slightly smaller than Mars, and it almost destroyed Earth, but it kept holding together just a little bit. And then that dust that was around Earth collected together to form what is the moon today. And this was actually verified by the moon landings in the 60s. The space rocks that they took verified the origins of the moon, in case you didn't know that. And then obviously all the mountains and valleys we have to get today were formed by plate tectonics on the crust moving over the mantle. That's how we have all of our mountains and our valleys. Biggest point on Earth, Mount Everest, as well as the deepest point on Earth, the Mariana Trench. And then all the water on Earth was slowly collected over millions of years by asteroids and comets, bringing a little bit of water. That's also how our atmosphere was formed. And then that finally culminates with what we'll talk about more next week. But then actually life began with energy being produced by lightning and thermal vents to create the first living things, and started what's called the RNA world period, which will be continued next week into evolution. So that's how science says Earth was made, according to my best, I'm not the best astrophysicist. So how can this conflict be resolved? In course of time, I'll kind of skip this, and at the end we can discuss a little bit more. We'll get to this later. So why does the age of this Earth matter? This is just kind of a summary slide. So the reason I did this topic, and some people may have thought this is kind of a weird topic to talk about, belief about the age of the Earth affects if you can even believe in other topics, and for example, evolution. So if you're of the mindset of a young Earth creationism viewpoint, with that mindset, obviously you can't possibly believe in evolution, because evolution takes a long time to occur. So we had to talk about age of the Earth before we can even talk about evolution. And then secondly, and I think this is kind of getting back to our point as Christians, is I think the age of the Earth and the age of the universe give us a taste of what eternity is like. Because as far as numbers, we can say 4.5 billion years, but we really don't understand that. And so I made this little graph just to help our feeble minds to understand what eternity is. So in this first one, this is 6,000 years. So if we say with young Earth creationism, that's how old the Earth is. And the oldest verified human we have on record lived around 122 years. And so if we stick her on here as this little block of time, this is age of the oldest living person, which is about 2% of the age of the Earth. So the 6,000 years is pretty long, but we live a decent amount of time. I mean, it's only like 50 lifetimes back on back to get to that 6,000 years. So it seems more feasible and easy to grasp that way. However, if you say the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, I was trying to get a similar size thing. I thought about doing the same 120 years, but we can't see, the pixel is too small. And then I tried doing 1,000 years, and the pixel is too small. And then I tried doing 10,000 years, and it's too small, 100,000 years. Finally ended up with 10 million years, and this is the little sliver of 10 million years. And we have this whole long bar graph of 4.5 billion years. So Earth is very old, the universe is very old, and if eternity is outside time and is infinite, I personally cannot understand with my feeble human mind. And I hope that gives you at least a little thinking about what God is like and how he is, he constructed this whole universe ultimately, to get to Jesus, but he also wanted to have a relationship with us lasting 120 years, if that. Probably most of us will be lucky to get to 90 or 100. And we're barely a pixel on the screen of life, which I think is really amazing that God wants to know us that way. So that's all I have as far as info. We can get to that last question. I know we're a little over on time, of how this resolves in terms of faith in science for the age of the Earth.